So if I have not mentioned that she is the daughter of the distinguished journalist and pioneer TV reporter in Afghanistan, Sandy Gall, it is because she has amassed an impressive CV of her own. Carlotta Gall.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak here. Zahid and Aisha are both great friends from years of working in Pakistan, so that's a great pleasure to be on the same panel. As you heard, I've been a foreign correspondent, mostly a war correspondent, for the last 20 years, the last 16 of them for the New York Times. And I've come from way back looking at Islamism, violent Islamism, and terrorism right from early on, even before I was a newspaper reporter. I was in Peshawar and came across in the refugee camps and in the aid circles that were looking after Afghan refugees. I saw some of these Arab fighters coming out from Afghanistan, and it was my first confrontation with a very, very hostile element of people who cared about the Afghans, who were involved in helping them in resisting the Russian invasion, but had a very, very different view from us, who were Western aid workers and journalists who were looking at the problem. And it was the first time I was spat at full in the face by someone, and that was my first encounter with what we called in those days Wahhabis. Now, bin Laden was actually there at that time in Peshawar. This was the late 80s, early 90s. And then I became a journalist, and I was working in Russia and went down to Chechnya. And I was reporting extensively on the first war there. As you know, the Chechens were asking for self-determination and independence from the Russians. And then we saw some Arabs turn up. And it was the same thing, very, very hostile to Westerners, very secretive about what they were doing. They were there to help fight. So I've followed this for years. So when 9/11 happened, I remember watching it in a hotel bar in Macedonia and telling people, I think it's bin Laden. So I've come from way back on this whole thing. But when 9/11 happened and I was working for an American paper, New York Times, of course I wanted to go back to Afghanistan and report it. And I ended up spending 10 years following the whole thing because it was, I felt, so important. It was where 9/11, the attacks of 9/11 came from, were thought up and were organized. But much more I saw something very damaging for a country that I'd come to know well, which was an emirate that wanted really such totalitarian control of the Afghans that it was frightening. And I think what we saw in the Taliban regime in Afghanistan was a forerunner of ISIS today. It's very similar. The whole way of running the emirate, the whole way of terrifying people, of indoctrinating young people, it's so similar. So just briefly, I wanted to tell you about the theme of my book, which I called The Wrong Enemy, because I think it explains a lot of where the West has gone wrong on Afghanistan and perhaps is not tackling things right today. I covered the whole war, so I saw the Taliban defeated in 2001. I then saw them resurge. They were completely gone from the country for 2 years, and then we started to see them coming back. There started being insurgent attacks. Taliban sighted in places. They started doing sabotage, bombs. It grew and grew until by 2008-9, they were close to Kabul, surrounding Kabul, and toppling the whole regime and upending the whole American operation there. And then we had the surge. Petraeus came in with a surge and pushed it back, and I think gave the Afghan government a chance again to hold on and to create a better society and keep the Taliban at bay. So that's what I was watching. And in 2006, I went to Quetta in Pakistan It's down near the border, southern border of Afghanistan. And I was looking for Taliban, and I was looking for families of suicide bombers who'd been blowing themselves up in Afghanistan. And we traced it back to Pakistan. Anyway, I did a few days of reporting, and then I was in my hotel room, and I got raided by secret police. They burst into the hotel room. They beat me up. They took all my equipment, all my notebooks, my telephones, and they arrested the photographer who was working with me. And one of the things they said, I got quite angry. I guess I was alarmed. They actually punched me in the face, and I fell over on the coffee table and smashed everything. And when I angrily remonstrated with them what they were doing, they said, "You're not allowed to go to Pashtunabad," which is a part of Quetta where a lot of Taliban were living, and you're not allowed to interview Taliban. And it summed up everything about the war. The Pakistanis were supporting the Taliban. They were allowing them sanctuary. They were living and running the whole Taliban insurgency from Quetta. And they didn't want reporters reporting on it. And a lot of Pakistani journalists knew much more than me, but they could never report on it. And in fact, after that incident, people who'd collaborated with me were told never to work with the New York Times again. They were told never to work with foreign journalists. Foreign journalists were dissuaded from traveling to Quetta. It was what happens, and is little written about in Pakistan, that journalists are told not to touch certain subjects, and this was one. It was the Pakistanis, and Pakistani intelligence, but Pakistani military running the Taliban insurgency against the Western mission operation in Afghanistan, and for their own reasons. And for years, this was never reported. It was difficult for a reporter like me to find the facts. But that incident really consolidated in my brain, and I went on to keep reporting and eventually exposed that the ISI was not only running the Taliban and supporting and funding them and directing them, but he was also collaborating with al-Qaeda, and they were hiding bin Laden, who, as you all know, was found in Abbottabad in a house in Pakistan, just 100 yards away from the top military academy. And eventually I exposed that he was not only protected, but he was being handled by Pakistani intelligence as a sort of asset, as an intelligence asset. He was under a sort of protective custody. He wasn't very mobile, but he was able to meet and liaise with his commanders and his people. So he was still running al-Qaeda from a safe house in Pakistan with the knowledge of their top intelligence agency. So what this whole decade of reporting there told me was that we were fighting the wrong enemy. When I say we, the NATO alliance, the Western alliance of US and British troops and many other nations. We were fighting Afghans in the villages, in the mountains. And we were always fighting serious battles and killing a lot of insurgents, but we never got to the crux of the matter and to the source of the problem, which was across the border in Pakistan. And they had training camps, they had recruiting mechanisms, they had funding coming in from all over the world, but and we never tackled that, and our governments never really openly confronted that. And as a journalist, of course, that began to really grate against me. But it was really also appalling to have to watch a war and report on so many casualties on all sides when our governments weren't really coming clean about where the problem was really coming from. And I think to this day, our governments haven't tackled the real problem that in Pakistan there is still sympathy, selective support of groups, and a double game, essentially. So that was the conclusion of my book. I am now working in Tunisia, in North Africa, and I would say that one of the biggest lessons from the Pakistan experience was that Afghanistan in the 90s was left alone to be run by militias and have lots of extremist groups training, recruiting, and operating very freely. It was really neglected Afghanistan in the 90s, which led to 9/11 attacks. Today, the same is happening in Libya. When I look at Libya, it's very similar to Afghanistan in the 90s. Or you might say Waziristan, the part of the tribal areas of Pakistan, in these last decade, because that's where Al-Qaeda and these militant groups were free, they were left alone, they were given sanctuary, and they created a great deal of damage by running camps, training people, recruiting more and more, and recruiting foreign fighters from all over the world. They are now, some of them have gone to join ISIS, some of them have gone to Libya, where they're operating. The Tunisians who were in Al-Qaeda are today in Libya now, and they're starting to attack Tunisia, their homeland, and they want an emirate across the whole of the North Africa. And it sounds a crazy idea, but it's what the Taliban did, it's what ISIS did. It's totally possible if we don't really look at what's happening, look at the sources, and look at the facility that they have when they have a lawless country like Libya.